But listen to the color of your dream. It is not leaving. All play the game. Existence to the end. Of the beginning.
Ladislav nodded absently and stood up to pace the room. He had to do something. If not just to salvage the concert, then to bring some peace and comfort to his friend. Ladislav headed for his bedroom, but stopped in the doorway to glance over his shoulder back at Widlowski. Widlowski was in absolute agony. His shoulders slumped, his hands shaking, and his expression drawn and full of misery. Widlowski rose after a moment, not looking back to where Ladislav stood. He wondered if Widlowski thought he had simply left him alone completely. Widlowski walked over to the far wall and brushed his hand against the Beatles' commandments. He looked at them for a long, silent moment before he picked it up and placed the frame down on the ground. Ladislav looked away from Widlowski as he mourned in solitude and looked over to his phone. Ladislav knew what he had to do, and he had to act fast, because if he didn't, nobody else would. Beata sat on her living room couch, thumbing through a magazine, looking up once in a while at her husband. Haritonov sat in his chair reading a newspaper. A cup of coffee sat on the table to his right. He hadn't yelled at her on the car ride home, or on the way back into the house, or while they'd gotten ready for bed. He hadn't said much of anything to her all night, all morning either. It was back to their routine, and Beata closed her eyes, hating herself for hating that fact. There was a part of her that hated all of it long before Widlowski had arrived. She could have handled the screaming and the shouting, the disappointment, but the silence was utterly killing her. She looked back at Haritonov, wanting to talk about it, wanting to talk about something while he remained quiet and content, reading his newspaper and drinking his morning coffee. Content to go back to normal, as if that were even possible, as if none of it had happened, as if she hadn't spent the last 3 nights sneaking out to talk to the man who had once captivated her attention and held her heart, the man with whom she shared a child. Even if Haritonov were the dad, Widlowski would always be the father. It was as simple as that. So why did it all feel so complex?
I'm sorry about...
It's fine.
No, really, if you want to talk about...
I don't want to talk about it again. Ever.
He went back to his newspaper. She stared at him a moment and then turned back to her magazine. After a few seconds, Beata began to quietly sing to herself a soft a cappella version of Purple Haze.
Purple haze all in my brain. Lately things, they don't seem the same. Acting funny, but I don't know why.
Would you mind keeping it down?
Oh, of course.
Thank you, dear.
Haritonov was still reading his newspaper, completely unaware that Beata's gaze lingered on him. He was completely unaware as her heart shattered into a million different pieces. Widlowski was carrying his bag, following Ladislav along the streets of Grashk. The people around laughed and smiled and lived free, even though Haritonov still existed to instill the old ways. The oppression of an entire regime hewn into one single man. A man who had all the power, Widlowski had to admit. Enough power that he was now leaving, as Haritonov had wanted all along. Ladislav made a turn in a strange direction.
This is an opposite way to the airport bus stop.
We just got to drop by somewhere.
On a crooked old town side street, Ladislav stops in front of a vintage record store.
Wanna come in with me?
What are you doing? I'm gonna miss my flight.
Just come on.
It was a small, weirdly shaped store, and a miraculous number of box after box of records were crammed onto tables and shelves, forming various narrow aisles that led from the front of the store to the back of it.
It is him?
There was a familiar lilt to the voice that had him turning around to see a woman facing him. She had long, curly black hair, which had him unconsciously reaching up towards his hair. She eyed him, and he realized in an instant that it was Beata's eyes that looked back at him. Ladislav nodded.
Yes, Julia, this is Widlowski. Widlowski, this is Julia, your daughter.
Julia,
That's right.
that's such a beautiful name.
No, stop. If you cry, I'm gonna cry.
Well, if you to cry, I'm definitely gonna cry.
I mean, I know. Can I hug you?
Julia was visibly struggling to make her smile warm and understanding, and she nodded as she half-stepped forward at the same time Widlowski did, closing that unseen distance between them. There wouldn't be another moment in their lifetimes where they wouldn't know each other, no matter what. But her eyes didn't follow her smile and stayed serious and focused until she looked away and stopped.
Maybe someday.
I'm sorry. I'm just so.
You don't have to apologize to me. I'm fine, really. I've got a life, a son of my own.
A son. My grandson.
That's right.
Maybe someday I could meet him too.
Maybe. But he has a granddad, even two.
But one is not. Who's your husband?
I don't have one.
This felt like an awkward exchange, somehow more awkward than it could have or should have been. Julia was in no way unique in not having a husband, but Widlowski couldn't shake off a feeling that there was quite a lot underneath he couldn't yet see. Right here, I realized that the second role of the narrator turns out to be Julia's son. He has no spoken lines and only mentioned once by Julia and Widlowski. But in time, we'll understand his meaning for the story. Julia took a deep breath and spoke in a somewhat unnatural, rehearsed tone.
I'm glad Ladislav called. I wanted to meet you, to get to know you. But I don't need you.
I understand. You are a grown woman.
But just because you're never going to be my dad doesn't mean you have to be a stranger.
Hey, think of all the great stuff he can still teach you. Like how to get into jail for playing 3 chords on an out-of-tune guitar. Huh?
You should know something though. I might not need you, but she does. She's a great mom, and he was never unkind to her, but there's always quite a lot missing. I didn't know what it was until I found out. I think it was you.
A long silence spread out as Julia's words hit home, as he realized that he, and only he, had missed it all. All the signs, all the times she had tried to tell him, even as she had let him go to freedom. When he had left her, it had destroyed him, but Widlowski had never truly considered what it had done to Beata, what she might have to do in order to survive. But this beautiful angel who now stood in front of him had been anything but afraid to throw out the bald truth. Something he'd needed, apparently, in order to see what was right in front of him.
Are you sure she's mine, Ladislav? Sounds too smart to be my genes.
No paternity DNA test needed.
God, I don't know anything about you. What are your favorite movies or books?
Maybe one at a time.
All right. What's your favorite song?
I'll give you one guess.
Yes, Julia. Well then, your second favorite?
Julia turned and moved down the aisle, looking through box after box of records. After a few flicks of her fingers, she smiled, pulled out an album, and walked over to the listening station near the left wall. Loading the record, she gestured for Widlowski to come closer. Julia quickly found the track and placed the headphones over his ears.
This one.